Hi, we're here today to talk about a major policy change announced by HHS and FDA on Monday, reversing a policy issued by HHS in August 2020, prohibiting FDA from requiring pre-market review for laboratory developed tests. I'm joined here by two partners from the MoFo FDA Regulatory and Compliance Practice. Stacy Klein-Amin, who joined our team recently after serving as FDA's Chief Counsel from 2018 to 2021, and Bethany Hills, who regularly represents clients in product development and compliance issues in front of the FDA. First, let's get started with a quick overview of how in vitro diagnostics are regulated in the United States. Unlike the EU and many other jurisdictions with robust regulatory frameworks that clearly distinguish between an IVD and a medical device, treating them as distinct product categories, the US regulates an IVD as a subcategory of a medical device. This has created a situation where the professional licensure of labs, the federal CLIA standards, and state oversight of the profession of laboratory science often collide with FDA's regulation of IVDs. FDA has traditionally defined an LDT as a test designed, manufactured, and used in a single laboratory that is certified under CLIA and that meets the requirements to perform high complexity tests. And that's the definition provided in Monday's guidance. But even this definition is a microcosm of the history between FDA and industry over this issue. And industry has resisted this definition. So Stacy, before we talk about the policy announcement this week, you've seen the history of this issue spanning your tenure as Chief Counsel of the Senate Health Committee to your more recent tenure as FDA's Chief Counsel, working closely with the Device Center leadership. Could you help us understand FDA's history with LDTs, including during COVID-19?
Yes, and I'll try to be brief. I think we could do a whole hour just on the subject of this history, or maybe we could teach a whole class on it. But I'll start just going back several decades, and FDA has taken the position for several decades that laboratory developed tests are that it has jurisdiction over laboratory developed tests as a medical device, the same as any other in vitro diagnostics. But FDA has had a policy of enforcement discretion for the most part for those several decades. Around 10 years ago, FDA started expressing concern about the public health implications of not overseeing this rapidly growing market, and concerns about the proliferation of tests being offered and whether those tests are safe and effective and whether consumers understood the risks of those tests. And growing out of that concern, in 2014, FDA issued a draft guidance that would require pre-market review of certain LDTs, and clearly asserting that those LDTs fit into the medical device definition. That draft guidance was met with a very swift and severe backlash from Congress and industry. And I was serving in Congress during that time, as you mentioned, Bridget, so I remember it well. And those debates sort of played out for several years. And then right on the eve of the beginning of the new administration, in January 2017, FDA announced that it would not be finalizing that draft guidance and instead issued a discussion paper. And that discussion paper was largely the framework of legislation that became the VALID Act, and FDA had pivoted to working on the VALID Act. But during that time that FDA was working on legislation, it continued to have a growing concern about safety and efficacy of tests being offered in the market. And the industry saw sort of some increased compliance activity from FDA during that time period, specifically concerns around pharmacogenetic testing and whether consumers were being harmed by tests sort of advising about the efficacy of a drug based on their genetics, as well as increased concern about direct-to-consumer tests. So that was the state of things heading into COVID-19 in January of 2020, is that, the industry had experienced this whiplash over a draft guidance that was then pulled back, but, continuing concerns expressed from FDA about the market, and I think concerns from industry about whether and when they might be subject to compliance activity. So heading into January 2020, FDA had traditionally viewed tests that would be used during a public health emergency differently than your sort of standard laboratory developed tests. And, during the Ebola and Zika pandemics, FDA had required laboratory developed tests to get emergency use authorization. And it was based on the concern that during a public health emergency, there's more of a need to ensure accurate testing, because false positives or false negatives could contribute to community spread. And that was the case in January 2020. FDA's policy was that COVID-19 LDTs needed an EUA before they could be marketed. But there was really a dire lack of testing at the beginning of the pandemic, which resulted in FDA sort of quickly shifting policy and offering flexibility to test developers. So FDA said, test developers you can develop and market your test for 15 days. And, during those 15 days, prepare your application, and then you can stay on the market while FDA reviews your EUA application. FDA also offered flexibility to LDTs that were working with their state oversight bodies. And that was another source of testing flexibility. And all of that was sort of abruptly upended in August 2020, when the Department of Health and Human Services, through a web posting, said that FDA could no longer require pre-market review of laboratory developed tests, including that it could no longer require an emergency use authorization for a laboratory developed test, which would include the COVID-19 tests. So the state that the industry has been living in since August 2020 is one where they can try to get an EUA from FDA. FDA sort of deprioritized review of some of those LDTs, which also has caused a lot of confusion and turbulence in the industry. So industry could try to get an emergency use authorization. Many have and did, or per the statement from HHS, they were not required, and FDA couldn't take enforcement action against those tests if they did not get an EUA. So that sort of brings us to Monday and the reversal.
Yes, thank you. And could you talk a little bit why, the new policy, talk about the new policy and why you think it was issued?
So the new policy, I'll start first with why was the new policy issued, or let me briefly describe what the policy does. So HHS stated, through its own web posting on Monday, that it no longer has a policy on laboratory developed tests that is separate from FDA's longstanding approach in this area. And that sort of addresses LDTs generally. And what FDA has said is that for COVID-19 laboratory developed tests, they have put out a new guidance that replaces the previous guidances and flexibilities that were offered for COVID-19 LDTs. And it's sort of, it's really like a cleanup guidance in many ways, because it addresses a number of other issues as well. It addresses serology testing, and it addresses some reporting and labeling issues with COVID-19 testing. So it really is, it's a broad guidance that is, frankly, a long time coming. It addresses prioritization of review, not just of LDTs. But what's significant for LDTs is that FDA will no longer be offering those flexibilities that it offered at the beginning of the pandemic. So, the reasons for that are, I think, well explained by FDA. At the time that those flexibilities were offered back in February 2020 and the early stages of the pandemic, there was almost no testing available. So FDA was really prioritizing quickly getting tests to the public. But now FDA has authorized over 400 tests. There are hundreds of millions of authorized tests that are now available to consumers. So the capacity concern isn't the same. Why should a consumer, use an unauthorized test when authorized tests are available, so widely available? And FDA has seen poor performing tests offered without an EUA and has concerns about false negatives and false positives and how they may be impacting consumers. And even, going back to October of 2020, FDA was describing, FDA issued a New England Journal of Medicine article describing some design and validation problems that it had seen in 82 of 125 LDTs that it reviewed. So this has been sort of a long time concern for FDA. And FDA has also pointed to the kinds of tests that the public needs right now being different. There's a need right now for at-home testing, and that at-home testing has never been subject to these discretions and flexibilities that FDA offered because of the different risks associated with those tests. Then there's a much greater need for high volume testing capacity, and there's also an increased need right now to ensure reporting to public health databases. So those are some of the reasons why FDA has issued the policy.
Great. Well, Bethany, you've been working closely with the MoFo team of regulatory and scientific experts and lawyers to prepare and submit COVID diagnostic EUAs on behalf of our clients, including obtaining some of the earliest EUAs issued for diagnostics very early on in the pandemic, as well as some of the recent, more innovative tests that are supplying a huge segment of the market right now. What do clients who don't yet have an EUA for their COVID-19 LDT need to know? And can you walk us through the process of getting a COVID-19 EUA?
Sure, I'd be happy to. This has taken up a lot of our time over the last 18 months, and the EUA statutory process is one that enables FDA to authorize medical products under a period when there's a declaration of emergency and the criteria of the statute have to be met, but essentially there would be no adequate, approved, or available alternatives. And FDA has, as Stacy mentioned briefly before, encountered these types of public health emergencies and declaration of emergencies over the past 2 decades. And in anticipation of need for using EUAs in public health emergencies, FDA did issue a final guidance in 2017 on EUA procedures. And this was, as we all know, well before the current COVID-19 emergency declaration. So I have to say, as somebody who's practiced in FDA regulatory law for a long time, we were pretty grateful at the moment that this was occurring in early 2020, that there was at least some thought put into what an EUA procedure would be like. And there was a framework available for us to think about it as we worked with test developers on how we might approach FDA and start working through the specifics of a COVID-19 related diagnostic EUA. And that guidance lays out a pre-EUA request and feedback process. And so I would say one of the things that has really changed most significantly is this idea of even going through a pre-EUA process. As Stacy mentioned, FDA has authorized over 400 tests under an EUA process. And they note in their most recent updated guidance that they've interacted with well over 1,000 test developers. And so what that means is the idea of doing a 2-step process, pre-EUA followed by feedback and then followed by an actual EUA, is really not efficient from a regulatory engagement standpoint. And so we have, in our practice, and I think in most instances, dropped the idea of using a pre-EUA feedback loop. And I would say now, as we're looking into the future with some really new innovative technologies on behalf of some of our clients, We are going to consider revisiting that and try and engage FDA for some specific questions. But the reason we don't really need a pre-EUA process in most cases is because the guidance that FDA has put out during this current pandemic has been very helpful and very, very clear, and has laid out a number of templates. And so when you go to the FDA website, you can actually see templates for pooled tests, individual tests, molecular tests, antigen tests, serology tests. And then each of those have variations of home use and home sample collection across the spectrum of those. And so within those templates, you can see the sections and the type of validation that FDA will require in order to actually authorize that particular test. And so that using that framework, we would sit down with companies and understand the test technology. We worked with developers directly at the science level to try and understand what are the features of your particular test that is going to enable FDA to prioritize it, right? Because everything about the pandemic has been about speed, really, until this moment. I think that's something worth noting at this point. The statement that came out on LDTs on Monday, which is the focus of our conversation here today, is also underpinned by this really important new guidance document that Stacy mentioned, right? And that really is identifying for us, I think, a turn in the policy and a turn in the pandemic where things may not move so fast. Things may be able to slow down a little bit more, and FDA is going to continue to prioritize things that make sense and tests that make sense based on current access and the accessibility of testing. In the past months, home collection and point of care tests have continued to be a priority, including fully over-the-counter home test kits where you can have everything done without a prescription and you can do the test and have the results delivered at home. And we've been working with clients to assess their validation data, to look at their stability data, to implement and assess their usability data in order to have those different types of tests put in front of FDA in an EUA, and then to encourage FDA to prioritize the test through really advocacy in the communication of that submission. And I will point out one thing that I found really interesting in the most recent guidance FDA gave on Monday is they've identified that they really are going to prioritize test developers with whom they have experience and with whom they have communicated before. And that means that they have trustworthiness in front of FDA, that they know the process, they understand the process, and they've demonstrated an ability to get through the EUA process. So for companies that have not been through an EUA process yet, I do think it's going to be an uphill battle as we now look into the future of COVID diagnostic tests.
Great, thank you so much, Bethany. And how has this changing policy on LDTs had a practical impact on clients developing COVID diagnostics?
It has been complicated. I think roller coaster may have been mentioned earlier. That is definitely a good word to use in this context. As we mentioned, the policies that FDA has put out have consistently supported access, right? Access to testing capacity. And to that end, there has been the policy that Stacy mentioned, which we refer to as the notification policy, which is you can develop a test, go ahead and start commercializing it, make it available, and then you have 15 days to submit an EUA. That notification policy, as it is applied to LDTs, has roller coastered throughout the pandemic. At one point, it was part of the normal process, and LDT could have used that, but then also was required to submit an LDT, was required to submit the EUA, and then there was the change in policy, and so there could be a notification that was given and you ended up on a list. Then there are tests that are LDTs that didn't provide notification to FDA, and so those are just functioning out there outside of the FDA's reach. And so we have we've definitely had differing application of that notification policy for sure. It makes it hard to know exactly what is on the market. In addition, in the actual, maybe I'll talk specifically about some of the very practical pieces in the EUA. An LDT that submits to FDA an emergency use authorization request has to utilize something called an EUA summary as opposed to an IFU. And so this goes into the technical details of what is a lab developed test compared to an in vitro diagnostic and how that definition is rolled out. There is a distinction, and FDA continues to maintain that in the requirements for the EUA. And instructions for use is something that you would have to put together if you were manufacturing and distributing test kits. But an EUA summary is actually a summary of the laboratory procedures that are going to be utilized in effectuating a lab-based test. And so what we've had to do in those circumstances is actually compile the underlying laboratory procedures, all of the SOPs. It can be a significant amount of operational and laboratory performance data in order to submit that as part of the EUA, and that becomes essentially part of the authorized test that FDA is authorizing in the EUA process. And it becomes a challenge in the post-EUA, post-authorization period, because as you might know, laboratory practices can change over time. You might want to make a particular procedure more efficient. You might change the step. You might skip a step. You might do something in your SOP to make it better or enhance it. And because those SOPs and ultimately roll into the EUA summary, and they are inherently part of the authorized test, this has made it a real challenge for figuring out those post-market authorizations within the EUA conditions of authorization that we have had to deal with.
And Bethany, it seems like test developers, even those with a test that could be considered an LDT under FDA's definition of an LDT, have been obtaining EUAs. So, before this new policy. So why is that?
I think, and I think Bridget thinks this, and I think Stacy thinks this. So I'll speak on behalf of all of us as to why we think this is happening. It's an act called, we refer to it as the PrEP Act. It's the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act. And once there's a HHS declaration that actually triggers the PrEP Act and authorizes its use, what it does is it offers immunity from liability for claims that are caused by or arising from administration or use of these medical countermeasures. And so in this context, the COVID diagnostic tests are considered medical countermeasures. That's how they're getting looped in under that EUA. And if they are authorized under an EUA, they, drumroll please, qualify for PrEP Act protection. And quite honestly, a limitation on liability, and not just a limitation, a complete immunity on liability by statute, extending to all of those involved in the development, manufacturing, testing, distribution, administration, use. I mean, so if you think about this, you have liability immunity all the way down, through the laboratory, through the doctor who's ordering the test, if it's a prescription use test, all the way to the end user, if the user, for those of you who are listening who had the deep nose brain tickle early on in the pandemic, if you got injured in that process, all of those are rolling back up into a liability immunity under the PrEP Act. And so I think that is a really important carrot that was dangled out in front of lots of test developers, and is one of the main reasons that we see our clients pursuing EUA, even if they may not have had to during this roller coaster of the LDT policy.
Can I make one point on that too, where I think we've been really helpful to our clients, is that I think we have anticipated this change in policy and have been advising, long before I arrived, and since I've been here, advising our clients about these shifting sands and not to rely on that August 2020 web posting. So I think that's been helpful too, that we have been able to anticipate for clients that they'll be more secure if they go through the process and get the EUA.
Yes. And Stacy, just to kind of circle back on an issue that we were talking about earlier, and I know this is an issue that a lot of either those who are interested in bringing a test to the market for the first time, or bringing a new edition of their test to the market. Can you talk a little bit more about prioritization under the new policy?
Yes, and FDA has really revamped the prioritization. It's largely consistent with the policies that they have previously stated, but there's a lot more detail in this guidance, and I think will be helpful. We've seen a number of clients trying to parse the words of some of the previous statements that have been made about the priorities, and now we can, really be specific with them. So the agency has said that it's prioritizing diagnostic tests, molecular and antigen, that can be used at the point of care or completely at home. But the tests need to be able to be used on symptomatic and non-symptomatic, so applicable to a broad patient population. And for laboratory-based tests, the agency is not going to review or prioritize antigen testing. They're looking for molecular diagnostic tests that are highly sensitive, high throughput, intended for pooling, for home specimen collection, for screening or detection of multiple analytes, and from experienced developers, as Bethany mentioned, and looking for home specimen collection kits intended for use with those molecular diagnostic tests. For serology tests, they're very specific about the serology tests that the agency will prioritize for review. So they're looking for quantitative measurement of antibody titers or qualitative detection of neutralizing antibodies. And I think the most important guidance that FDA gave with respect to these priorities was getting specific about the manufacturing capacity that they're looking for. So when they say, high capacity, they're looking at they're looking for the capacity to scale up to over 500,000 tests per week within 3 months of authorization. So I think it really is something that I know many in the industry are trying to figure out right now, how many LDTs are going to fit into that category, and how many will have to come off of the market. So then to talk a little bit about timing, for tests that have already submitted an EUA request before February 1st, 2021, FDA would like those developers to let them know within 45 days that they still want review and that the applications are current. And otherwise, FDA would expect those manufacturers to cease marketing at the end of that 45-day period or within 15 days of notification that FDA declines to review or declines to issue the EUA. For tests that have not yet submitted an EUA request, those tests have 60 days from the date of the guidance to submit an EUA request. And if they're notified that they will not have a review or will not have an EUA issued, then they have 15 days to stop marketing. So we're looking at all of this coming to a head potentially in January, February of 2022.
Thank you for sort of putting a goal, not goalpost, but sort of a time marker on when we kind of expect some of these issues to become more prominent. And one thing that I will point out for those of you who are more visual like me, that at the end of the guidance, FDA has put in some flow charts that sort of visually depict the different sort of if-then conditions for when you need to be making notifications or filing an EUA with FDA. So we were kind of hinting at this, so let's get into it. The saber rattling from various corners. It does seem like a lawsuit from industry, the laboratory industry may be imminent. We're not sure, which party exactly it might be, but Stacey, can you comment on the prospects of such a lawsuit?
Yes, and I'll just comment briefly to say that FDA has seen in recent years an increasing number of lawsuits that are either based on or include, as a significant component of the lawsuit, an argument that FDA has inappropriately changed policy. So we've seen it in a number of lawsuits where FDA sort of changed a guidance document or maybe withdrew a guidance through a Federal Register notice, or even challenges to FDA warning letters These are all, there's just been a lot more of them recently, and they're novel issues for FDA to litigate, because typically you would see litigation where there's clear final agency action. So that would look like, an enforcement action from the agency, not a warning letter or an untitled letter or a change in policy. So I have seen I've seen some statements from folks indicating that they, may be looking to sue FDA over this change in policy. And I think that will be one of the big issues that will have to be addressed in that litigation. But, one of the things that I think may be unsatisfying to industry about that litigation is that it just perpetuates the state of uncertainty that the industry has been in, really for years. Bethany mentioned the roller coaster, and Bridget, I think you did as well. And there's been sort of these shifting sands for industry, and they're finding it hard to predict what the future looks like. And I think there's a real desire, at least that, I've been hearing from many in industry, there's a real desire to pivot now to finding a long-term solution and long-term certainty over what, regulation looks like in this space.
Thank you. And could you tell us about the recent developments in Congress and whether you expect to see action from Congress?
Yeah, so I had mentioned earlier that FDA had really pivoted to focusing on legislation, and one of the primary legislative vehicles that's out there is the Ballot Act. It was introduced in the last Congress. It's been reintroduced in this Congress. So what I hear about the most is the Ballot Act, and that provides a risk-based framework for regulation of LDTs and other diagnostic tests that would, try to balance the need to ensure safety and efficacy of testing, while also continuing to promote innovation in the market. But I think really, regardless of whether it's the Ballot Act or some version of the Ballot Act or some other form of diagnostics reform, I think there's a very, very good chance that some kind of diagnostics reform is part of the MDUFA package that Congress will vote on next year. And it's just something that I have been hearing from so many sources in Congress, that there's really strong support for some kind of reform that can provide certainty to industry. And then I hear so much support from sources in industry as well, that they, just don't want the shifting sands or the roller coaster anymore. They want to look, they want to look for that certainty.
And Bethany, can you comment a bit on what the Ballot Act, if passed as written now, what it might mean for our clients and the industry in a broader sense?
Yeah, I would say big caveat that it's going to have to make its way through the sausage making. So we don't expect that it may look as though it's been proposed. But this goes back to the comment you made earlier, Bridget, at the beginning, which is the current US regulatory system for IVDs is very different from other jurisdictions. And we don't distinguish in law, in statute, the difference between a medical device and an in vitro diagnostic. And the legal framework doesn't take into account the fact that many in vitro diagnostics are not kits or direct-to-consumer products or those that are used in the home, but are actually laboratory-based tests that are run in a licensed laboratory and are part of the practice of laboratory science. And so that is going to be a really big change for companies. And I think that is the purpose, right, is to stop this roller coaster and create some solid information to work from. What I think is exciting about it is it's going to create a framework for us to help clients assess their products, assess their tests, figure out if they need pre-market authorization. If they don't, if there are exemptions, there are some grandfathering provisions built into the existing draft. There are some really great ideas built in about software and how software in the laboratory context would be managed in conjunction with the testing authorities. So I think that this would be a really great change for I think for everyone, so that we would have some certainty, but also it creates a framework that is more aligned with the international standards. And it is very much an international market at this point in time. Many of our clients do not only function in the United States, they have products all over the world. And this is going to help align those in one way or another, whatever it turns out to be.